Hello everybody and welcome back to The Lost Planeswalker. You're here with me, Jesse, The Lost Planeswalker. And today, we're back to another Commander deck tech. This one is going to be all about Sacrifice. On Monday, I released a video talking about Sacrifice and some of the really cool strategies you can build. Well now, I'm here to show off a deck I made all about it. I'm using one of my favorite deck building websites, Archedeck. Their deck building website is really nice and I recommend it to any of you out there. First off, we have a really nice feature. It tells you your deck size, if all the cards in your deck are legal, and also a breakdown of cost and salt. Now, the estimated cost of this deck is about $140 excluding basic lands, and the salt sum is almost average, but a little below. With that, let's move on and look at our commander. So our commander of this deck is Mahadi Emporium Master, legendary creature, Cat Devil. At the beginning of your end step, create a treasure token for each creature that died this turn. Mahadi is a really cool creature that we will not only benefit on greatly, but we can use those strategies to become a powerful threat against our opponents. Starting off with artifacts, let's look at some of the ones I included in this deck. Right off the bat, Arcane Signet, Command Sphere, and Sol Ring are all staple cards that are great in this deck. The first sack outlet I included is Ashnod's Altar. You can sack any creature and add 2 mana to your mana pool. This is such a cool ability, and you can use it to gain a lot of mana and cast even bigger spells from your hand. Mind Stone is for 2 mana, taps for mana, and you can sacrifice it to draw a card. Oni Call Anvil is a really cool card, because whenever you sack an artifact, you create a 1/1 colorless artifact creature token once per turn. You can also sacrifice the altar to deal 1 damage to each opponent and you gain 1 life. Since you'll be sacking treasure tokens, you'll be getting a lot of little 1/1 constructs that you can sack other ways to gain card advantage. For a little bit of mana fixing, I added in Rakdos Signet. For 1 mana, it taps for a black or red. And our final artifact is Wayfarer's Bauble. 1 mana to cast, and then for 2 and tap, sack it, search for a basic land, put it on the battlefield, tap, then shuffle. Now, let's move on to the creatures. The first creature I've included is Academy Manufacturer. If you create a clue, food, or treasure, instead create 1 of each. This is going to have you creating lots and lots of artifacts that you can either sacrifice or use to gain advantage. Ardaz, Cobbler of War, is a neat goblin that not only buffs up your creatures temporarily when they enter the battlefield, but you can create little tokens that you can use to sack if you have nothing else to do. Blood Artist is a staple card in Rakdos sacrifice decks. Whenever another creature dies, target player loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. Braid's Arzian Nightmare is a really cool card that allows you to sack a card at your end step, and each opponent has to either sack that or take 2 damage and let you draw a card. Carrion Feeder. This is a really great card that you can get bigger and bigger subtly over the length of the game, making it a big threat. Demon's Disciple is a great card because it forces your opponents to sack a creature. If they only have 1 creature on the board, well, they gotta get rid of it. And this will also make you a lot of treasure at the end of each turn. Disciple of Vault is going to be a really great card for this deck because whenever an artifact is put into your graveyard, you can have a target opponent lose 1 life. You'll be doing this over and over, making this 1 mana card one of the best in your deck. Dockside Chef is another cool card. For 1 and a black, you can sack an artifact or creature to draw a card. So you can make a bunch of treasures and use those treasures to draw more cards. Endrick Sar, Master Breeder. This is a really cool card because whenever you play a creature spell, you put X 1/1 black thralls onto the battlefield where X is its converted mana cost. This will get you a lot of little creatures you can pump into your deck. The only downside is if you have 7 or more, then you have to sacrifice him. Fleshbag Marauder is just like Demon's Disciple, and you can use it to gain a lot of treasure. Garna, Bloodfist of Keld, is a really cool creature that whenever another creature you control dies, draw a card if it was attacking. Otherwise, Garna deals 1 damage to each opponent. You're going to be creating a lot of little creatures, and each time when you sack them, it's going to be dealing 1 damage to your opponents, is slowly going to drain them down faster and faster. Goldspan Dragon is kind of a little bit of an outlier here, and it's one of the more expensive cards in this deck, but you're going to get double your value from your treasure, making it an awesome card and definitely worth including. Grim Hireling is a really neat card because whenever 1 or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, you create 2 treasure tokens. You can also sack a number of treasure tokens to give a creature -X/-X till end of turn. Ingenious Artillerist is going to be a great card because it is going to deal damage every time you make an artifact. Jadar, Ghoul-Caller of Nephilia is a really fun card because it'll create sack fodder that you can get back every turn. Judith the Scourge Diva was another co-commander I was considering for this deck. It not only buffs your creatures, but whenever a non-token creature you control dies, Judith deals 1 damage to any target. Jury, Master of the Review, is another co-commander I include in this deck. Whenever you sacrifice permanent, put a +1/+1 on him, and whenever he dies, you deal that damage to any target. This could be a really great card if you get him really big and you can sack it and throw it at your opponent and knock them out of the game. Krenko Mob Boss is a really neat card that you can tap to add X 1/1 goblin creature tokens for the number of goblins you control. This card gets more powerful the longer it's on the board, and you will have plenty of sack fodder once it's been on there long enough. Krenko Tin Street Kingpin also creates a lot of creatures and gets bigger during the process. Lagamos, Hand of Hatred, is another co-commander in this deck. He creates little elementals that have haste and sacrifice at the beginning of the next end step. Loyal Apprentice makes 1/1 colorless Thopter creature tokens at the beginning of combat if you control your commander. Lysolda the Blood Witch is one of my favorite sacrifice cards. She is also another co-commander, and you can use her either to gain card advantage or deal damage, or both. Marionette Master is a really great card for this deck because whenever an artifact you control is put into your graveyard from the battlefield, target opponent loses life equal to Marionette Master's power. This is a really good card. You're doing lots and lots of damage every time you crack a treasure token. Mayhem Devil is just a great creature because whenever a player sacks a permanent, it deals 1 damage to any target. Nadir's Nightblade is another awesome card in this deck because whenever a token you control leaves the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1. Not only will you gain life and make your opponents lose it when you crack your treasure tokens, but all of the other little creature tokens you create as well will feed into this card's power. Pawn of Ulamog is another card in this deck that creates a bunch of creature tokens, and you can either sack those creatures with something else on your board or sack them with their own ability and create colorless mana. Pitiless Plunderer is a great card in this deck. It has really good treasure token synergy because whenever another creature you control dies, you create a treasure token. Plaguecrafter is by far the best of one of the creatures that makes you and your opponents each sack a creature, because it also makes your opponents discard a card if they can't sack a creature. Professional Facebreaker is an amazing card in this deck, especially with your commander, because you can sack treasure tokens to exile the top card of your library and be able to cast it this turn. This allows you to get impulsive card draw and can really put you ahead. Reassembling Skeleton is one of my favorite cards in my Lysolda the Blood Witch deck, so I included it in here. You can use its ability to return it from the graveyard to the battlefield to continue to sack it as much as you desire. Reckless Fireweaver is another amazing card, especially with this commander, because every time an artifact enters the battlefield, it's going to be dealing damage to each of your opponents. Stormkiln Artist is not as great in this deck because his Magecraft ability isn't going to be as useful, but he still gets +1/+0 for each artifact you control, which will be a lot. Viscera Seer is a great card for this deck because it allows you to sack those creature tokens and scry the card you want right on top of your library. Zorn is another amazing card in this deck because whenever you would make 1 treasure, make an additional treasure as well. And lastly, we have Zulaport Cutthroat that says whenever Zulaport Cutthroat or another creature you control dies, each opponent loses life and you gain 1. Now, let's move on to enchantments. There's only a few enchantments in this deck because my main focus was on creatures. Flame Shadow Conjuring is our first enchantment that lets you create a creature for 1 red mana if it isn't a token when it enters the battlefield. You then have to sack it at the beginning of the next end step, but it has haste, so it can come in swinging, die, you create a treasure token, and you can pay for another creature next turn. Revel in Riches is one of the best cards, and it's going to be an alternate win con for this deck. Whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, create a colorless treasure token, and if you have 10 or more treasure tokens, you instantly win the game at the beginning of your upkeep. Sticky Fingers was one of my favorite cards from New Capenna because not only does it give a creature you control menace, but whenever it deals combat damage, you create a treasure token, making it a really cool 1-drop card. Warstorm Surge is also another great card. This deck is really creature heavy, and you'll be creating a lot of creature tokens, so whenever a creature enters the battlefield, you can deal damage equal to its power to any target. With those out of the way, let's move on to instants. Again, we're going to be focusing in on creatures, so there isn't that many instants in this deck. First off, we have Deadly Dispute, which, as an additional cost to cast a spell, you sacrifice an artifact or creature. Draw 2 cards, then create a treasure token. Rakdos Charm is a really cool card, and I like to include it in all of my Rakdos decks. You choose one, exile all cards from target player's graveyard, destroy target artifact, or each creature deals 1 damage to its controller. You're probably not going to choose the last one because you're going to be creating a lot of creatures, but exiling your graveyard and destroying an artifact is a really powerful ability. Terminate is maybe one of the best creature removal spells that there is. Not only does it destroy a target creature, but it prevents it from being regenerated. Village Rites is also another great card. As an additional cost to cast a spell, you have to sack a creature, but you draw 2 cards. Now let's move into lands. Like the last video, I wanted to keep the lands pretty basic. I didn't want to add anything too fancy that would increase the deck's price a bunch, so here's what I picked. Bloodfell Caves enters battlefield tapped, but you gain a life. There isn't a lot of other life gain options in this deck, so I thought, why not? Command Tower is an all-around great staple card. It's better than any of the dual lands because it lets you tap for any color in your commander's color identity. It's the best color fixing card there is. Next, we have Mountains and Swamps, and finally we have Sulphur Springs, which is one of the pain lands that you will take 1 damage and you can create a red or black, or you can just tap it for a colorless normally. Now let's move into sorceries. There's a few more sorceries than there are instants or enchantments, and that's because there's some really good sorcery cards that synergize with Sacrifice. Because Mahadi says at your end step you create treasure tokens for each creature that died this turn, you can play cards like Blasphemous Act or Chain Reaction, and then cast them afterwards and gain a ton of treasure by wiping the board. Jeska's Will is one of those cards I want to include in every red deck, especially if you control your commander. You can either create red mana for each card in a target opponent's hand, or you exile the top 3 cards of your library, and you may play them this turn. And if you control your commander, you can do both. Next up, we have Reanimate, which puts a target creature card from your graveyard onto the battlefield. Then, you lose life equal to its converted mana cost. For just 1 black, this card can be very powerful and well worth the life loss. Sign in Blood is a really cool black draw spell. You can draw 2 cards and lose 2 life. But if your opponents are low on life, you can make them draw cards and lose life, and maybe even knock them out that way. Torment of Hailfire is probably one of the best game-ending cards there is. If you have enough mana, which you will be creating plenty in this deck, you can pay X black and repeat the following process X times. Each opponent loses 3 life unless that player sacrifices a non-land permanent or discards a card. This card gives your opponents the opportunity to make some decisions, but if you pump it for high enough, you may not give them any solutions at all, and they will just lose the game. Vandal Blast is a really cool card because it destroys a target artifact you don't control. But if you overload it, it can destroy all target artifacts you don't control. And finally, our last card is Victimize. Choose 2 target creature cards in your graveyard. Sacrifice creature. If you do, return the chosen cards to the battlefield tapped. This is one of my favorite black recursion spells, especially because it's so cheap to cast and buy. Now let's look at some stats. You can see here that our black and red producers are pretty similar to the amount of black and red pips we have in the deck. Also, our overall mana curve is very low for this deck, 2.7. That's going to be really good, and we're going to be able to cast a lot of cards from our hand using treasure tokens. Moving down to the bottom here, one of my favorite things Archideck does is it tells you what kind of deck tokens you're going to need. So I'm going to need Clue, Construct, Copy, Eldrazi Spawn, Elemental, Food, Goblin, Servo, Thopter, Thrall, Treasure, and Zombie creature tokens. If I was to include a couple other cards that I think were a little too expensive to put in this deck, I would say Grave Pact and Dictate of Erebos. Part of the reason I didn't include those cards to begin with is because they can be really hard to play against and make your opponents have a really bad time. You'll be able to sack any number of creatures your opponents control with all of the creatures you're going to create, continuously killing your opponent's creatures. And this is one of the drawbacks of a sacrifice deck. It sometimes can be really frustrating to play against and can leave a bad taste in some of your friends' mouths. So be careful and just make sure that you're not being too oppressive. Well, I hope you enjoyed. This was the second deck tech I did following my Back to the Basics videos. I hope this was cool. I hope you enjoyed this. If you want to see that video, it will be linked in the description and also in the cards in the top corner. Also, I do all kinds of other videos, so check out my channel for more. If you enjoyed this video, if you thought it was helpful, please consider leaving a like and subscribe. That really helps me get out there, get some more subscribers, and I'm able to do more content like this. So, thank you. And with that, it's time to wrap up. So, I hope you have a great day, and as always, I'll see you later, Planeswalkers.